I'd like to do today is have both of our writers, who I'm going to introduce very shortly, I'm going to introduce them as they go up to read. We're going to start with 5 to 10 minutes or thereabouts, whatever you choose to do, of a reading from both of our authors. And then I have some questions that I'd like to ask them, but the biggest point is that I want to have the opportunity for you to ask questions. So we're going to split our time that way. And thank you so much for coming to see Joan Barfoot and Guy Vanderhaeghe in conversation. So we're going to start with Joan, who's going to be reading. Joan Barfoot, truly one of the brightest lights in the constellation of London's growing literary fame, is the award-winning author of 11 novels. Pause on that, 11 novels. Beginning with Abra, 1978, which won the Books in Canada, now Amazon Prize for first novels. Followed by Dancing in the Dark, which was made into a movie directed by Leon Marr and starring Martha Henry, a film that was shown at Cannes Film Festival, and then also at New York City Film Festivals. It was around that time, too, that Joan Barfoot was the Canadian delegate to the first International Feminist Book Fair Festival, or Book Fair and Festival in England, and I believe that was in 1983, a fact that I found quite fascinating when I was sifting through the biography in preparation for today. Barfoot then published Duet for Three, Family News, Plain Jane, Charlotte and Claudia Keeping in Touch, Some Things About Flying, and Getting Over Edgar. During this flurry of activity, she accepted the YWMC Women of Distinction Award here in London, Ontario, the Marian Engel Award, and edited A Time Apart, Letters of Love and War, a record of 4 years of letters between Nora Engineer, and I hope I'm saying that right, an Owen Sound housewife, and her husband Fred, stationed overseas. Soon thereafter, she released Critical Injuries, longlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and shortlisted for the Trillium Award, followed by Luck, shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize. Shortly after that, she received the Huron University College Medal of Distinction. In the midst of all this activity, if you can believe it, Joan has continued her work as a journalist for several newspapers across the province of Ontario, including the London Free Press. She is a distinguished Western graduate from the Department of English and was recently conferred an honorary Doctor of Literature in 2012 in recognition of her contributions to the literary and cultural landscape in Canada. I have quite a few colleagues who attended that convocation ceremony and were abuzz singing her praises for offering such a memorable address on the topic of this festival, words, the power of words, the use of words, the misuse of words. Joan Barfoot also teaches creative writing, and we are very pleased to welcome Joan today to speak with us and to read. Thank you very much. Please help me welcome Joan.
I'm going to read a little bit from Luck, I think, just to start off, partly because I really actually enjoyed writing it. It's perhaps, I hope, more amusing than it will sound, I hope. The last 3 or 4 novels, I probably found my own voice rather than entirely developing fictional voices. Characters aren't autobiographical in any way, but I enjoyed more as my career went on, having a little fun with the way I think, instead of always about how my characters think. Anyway, here's the first bit of Luck, and in the first page it hopefully spells out what the actual theme of the book is. There is good luck and there is bad luck, and then there's the ambiguous sort of luck that's a lot of this and some of the other. For instance, when Philip Laurence, already recipient of a reasonably gratifying life, has the misfortune to die, he is just 46, which in some other part of the world or some other century would be a grand old age, but is terribly young in this place and time. On the other hand, it is his good luck to die quietly in his bed, apparently in his sleep, a remarkably mild and merciful, even enviable ending. So when Philip Laurence drifts in the embrace of good luck and bad out of life in the course of an August night, while the air conditioning wafts its comfort indoors, while outside grass shrivels, flowers wilt, trees droop, animals pant for moisture and air, When the moon is bright but the curtains are drawn and the big old house is mainly silent except for the sounds big old houses make to themselves in the night, there is no particular need to feel sorry for him. Surely if he has suffered at all, it can have been only briefly. A different matter entirely for the living. Not at all enviable or awash in good fortune is whoever wakens beside him and stretches, running the planned events of the day muzzily through the mind, reorienting slowly to the deliciously ordinary or the warmly anticipated, and finds herself on the pillow next to, on the same mattress as, the inert, the cooling, the truly departed. An unambiguously nasty moment for that person, turning to speak, turning to touch. This is no way for a day to begin, nor really for anything else to begin, but like it or not, there is death lurking, life's great big vanishing question mark. Might as well see what's to be made of it. Buck up and face it, since one way and another, everyone must. Today, death is rolling into the lives of Nora, Sophie, and Beth, and it won't be long before the entertaining question will arise. Which of the three draws the cosmic short straw? Who wakens amiably beside Philip Lawrence and is hurtled unprepared into horror and shock? What does she do? How does she tell the others? Oh, many questions to spark the tongues of the villagers. Those villagers Nora has lately come to feel who might in another country, another century, have gathered up torches to carry to the house on the hill, intending to punish and with any luck burn. But Nora's imagination is in morbid overdrive anyway, since she is, in fact, the one who draws the short straw. It's Nora who feels consciousness creeping back an hour or so after the dawn, who is cooled by air conditioning, not by death, who rolls onto her back and stretches her legs and curls her plump arms over her head, feeling the exhilarating blood warming her arteries and her veins, who begins ticking off in her mind the anticipated events of the day ahead, and who finally turns to Philip, her husband, and wouldn't the villagers be disappointed to know it's Nora, respectably beside him at this unrespectable moment, and sees him smiling a strange, drawn, pale smile. A rictus, as it turns out. Nora does not understand this right away. Most people don't absorb new information quite that swiftly. She thinks he is having a dream, even a pleasant dream, considering the strange smile. There's much to be done, though, no time to waste waiting for dreams, however pleasant, to run their generally unmemorable course. And so she says, softly but cheerfully, intending to give an optimistic bounce to the start of the day, "Philip, wake up, time to get going." Their plans are to drive to the city a couple of hours away and meet up with Max for lunch and a discussion of a show of her work within the next year or so. Max, who owns a gallery and has represented her for almost 2 decades, only a few days longer than she's known Philip, wants to set tentative dates. He has also mentioned he would like to see fresh directions, as she would herself, but these things take time to begin revealing themselves and then to sink in. So, lunch at a fine and faraway restaurant with Philip and Max, an intense but also languorous conversation with 2 good men on various interesting subjects. What could be a happier prospect? Not to mention that this could be one of those exciting days in which new directions come clearer, as it will be. Come on, let's go, we've got lovely big plans. Philip, an exuberant man, tends to respond to exuberance, if also less openly and appealingly, to certain kinds of mute need. Whatever his preferences, Nora can only use the devices and charms she has. It is too late to figure out new ones. Later than she could have imagined, Philip is not merely resisting her, content in his dream. She realizes this as her hand grips his arm, intending to shake him, although gently, beginning the day as it should be begun, if it is to continue as it ought to continue. His arm is curiously unmalleable. It will not be easily shaken. It implies an absence that has not been implied before. Nora screams. She leaps up. She immediately regrets not the leaping, who would not leap, but the scream. It calls attention, it calls the others. She has lost the moment that was just hers. Drawn by the highly unusual sound of Nora screaming, Beth dashes into the bedroom doorway from one direction, her thin cotton nightie awry. And from the other direction comes Sophie, still in the process of struggling into her robe, one arm caught and the material flying. Sophie sleeps naked, which it would please the villagers to know, but which does not please Nora, already thoroughly distressed and in no mood for a vision of Sophie's large bounding breasts, her fleshy hips, that clutch of invasive red pubic hair, particularly tasteless and bold in the circumstance. Also, what if Philip weren't dead? What sort of state would this be to arrive in? What? Beth has the slight voice of a girl, insufficient to many occasions, absurd and offensive in this one. Sophie's tone, her, what is it, what's wrong, is also inappropriate. Too hearty, too ready to take action, to defend or to diagnose, and then repair. No defense possible, no repairs to be done, diagnosis too late. He's dead, Nora says, her own voice not quite under control, still surprised. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm going to bring up our next speaker. Guy Vanderhaeghe has written 5 novels, 3 collections of short stories, with a 4th on the way, he tells me. That's the correct. 2 plays, and authored the screenplay for a CBC television adaptation of The Englishman's Boy as a miniseries. Man Descending, his first collection of short stories published in 1982, captured the Canadian literary imagination immediately, winning the Governor-General's Award for Fiction and the Faber Prize in Great Britain. His novel Homesick was a co-winner of the 1990 City of Toronto Book Award, and his play I Had a Job I Liked won the Canadian Authors Association Award for Drama in 1993. Guy's first historical novel, a Western entitled The Englishman's Boy, won his 2nd Governor-General's Award in 1996, and its film adaptation with the CBC in 2008 won 6 Gemini Awards, including Best Dramatic Miniseries. The Englishman's Boy would become the first of what Guy calls a loose trilogy of novels, set largely in the 1870s, about the cross-border whoop-up country that continued with The Last Crossing, which won CBC's Canada Reads and 3 Saskatchewan Book Awards. And he recently finished with A Good Man. This trilogy of historical novels, which tarry with some of the genetic moments that shape not only the Western provinces, but the identity of Canada, has occupied Vanderhaeghe's imagination for decades. He has received both the Harbourfront Literary Prize and the Timothy Findley Prize, and is an Officer of the Order of Canada, a member of the Saskatchewan Order of Merit, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He has taught creative writing at the University of Ottawa and St. Thomas More College, amongst others, and currently lives in Saskatoon. I actually met Guy as part of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, where I was a Trudeau Scholar and he was a Trudeau Fellow. It was actually during a reading from one of his novels in Gananoque where Guy made a mention of Henri Bergson. Obsessed at the time as I was with Bergson, I asked a question about Bergson's notion of temporality in relation to the novel. Guy quickly disavowed any knowledge of reading Bergson earlier.
Not quite. only the Ilan Vital Bergson.
But went on to give an absolutely beautiful response on the temporality, and the idea of temporality in the Canadian novel. His response was incredibly modest, understated, but exceptionally brilliant. Please join me in welcoming Guy Vanderhaeghe.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Youth remembers things better than old age does, but I actually did remember your question about Henri Bergson because I was poleaxed by it. One of the problems of reading from a novel is that you often need an incredible amount of setup to explain the point that you're going to read from, which often makes you sound like a 5-year-old talking about their favorite movie. So I will just briefly say that in part, the novel I'm going to read from, A Good Man, deals with the relationship between a Northwest Mounted Police officer, Colonel Walsh, who was removed from his post because of his support for Sitting Bull when Sitting Bull spent time in Canada after what was then known as the Massacre of the Little Bighorn. I'm going to read a brief section from the novel which shows the Sioux and Sitting Bull in defeat when they were being paraded, more or less paraded before the American public. So Sitting Bull and his people are arriving on a steamboat in Bismarck, North Dakota. The steamer edged to the dock. Mooring lines were cast and secured, a gangplank rattled into place. Ashore, hats were lifted and waved. The deckhands surged to the gunwales and returned the salute. There was much neck craning and bobbing on tiptoes, a bit of sporadic cheering and a smattering of hand clapping, as if the audience was urging Sitting Bull to bound on stage and commence the afternoon's entertainment. In a few minutes, captive Indians began to appear on deck, and the restive crowd quieted. In the hush, Sioux began to shuffle down the gangplank, throwing worried glances at the mob. Every onlooker was speculating on which of them was Sitting Bull. The Indians had put on their best articles of clothing: buckskin leggings with richly quill-worked and beaded cloth strips, war shirts, eagle-bone breastplates, plumed headdresses. Some had draped themselves in the Hudson's Bay blankets they had acquired in Canada. All the spectators were eager for their first glimpse of Sitting Bull, but they had no way of identifying him. No photograph of the Sioux chieftain had ever been taken. Everyone assumed that Bull, given his position, would cut the most impressive figure. But in the midst of this display of finery, it was difficult to decide exactly who was the most dazzling. A member of the Fourth Estate cried out, "Which of those beauties is the slightly recumbent gentleman cow?" A boatman leaned out over the railing and pointed. "There." Towards the tail of the retinue, a stocky man came limping down the gangplank in an old white shirt, blue pantaloons, and worn moccasins sprinkled with a few seed beads. His braids were wound with strips of red flannel. His shirt was streaked with scarlet. So too was his face, neck, and the part in his hair. Red was the color of life and charity. A red border painted on the bottom of a Sioux lodge announced that all who visited there would be fed. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. Just back up. Red was the color of life and charity. A red border painted on the bottom of a Sioux lodge announced that all those who visited there would be fed. In the hard times, the hunger times, Sitting Bull had opened his hands to his people and given away most of his worldly possessions to feed and comfort them. His generosity had made him poor. Now he had become the object of charity. The captain of the boat had given him a gift, a pair of smoked goggles, which lent him the black, blank stare of an insect. His gaze unsettled everyone it fell upon. It seemed so terrible, so inhuman, that they found themselves averting their eyes from it. Thank you.
Terrific. Yesterday, Guy told me that you both were at some point in time represented by the same publisher, so you would have encountered one another quite a bit along the road. So I think this is the first time in a while that you've had the chance to sit together on an author's panel. So wonderful. Maybe I'll begin with Guy. In a lecture that you gave in New Brunswick on the historical novel, I promise this isn't an Henri Bergson question. You described
it's a test to see what I can remember.
Yeah. You described the difficult process of writing The Englishman's Boy, a book that you called had an elephantine gestation period of 14 years, in which you were working through the remainders of graduate training in history to emerge on the other side with more novelistic impulses. The discovery you made, as you say, is to place greater emphasis, and I love the way that you phrase this, on the noun rather than the adjective of the historical novel. So on the novel. Can you walk us through the process of this discovery? I suppose 14 years would resemble more like an Homeric quest rather than a walk, but if you could walk through the way in which that discovery came about.
Well, I mean, as I've often said and often give evidence of, I'm not that bright. So it took me some time to get over my formation as a graduate student. My big worry in writing a historical novel was the idea that in some way the historical novel should be more like history than a novel, which obviously it shouldn't be. I finally arrived at the point that historical events and historical characters would become the skeleton of a book. But the one thing that the historical novel can do, I think, that history has difficulty doing, is making the past a more intimate experience. And I don't want to go on at length about this, but one of the things is that history is often an explanation of how things came to be, as if there was never any other possibility, which sometimes leaves the impression that people going through any event should have behaved differently than they did to arrive at the right outcome. I believe the past, for those living it, was as much a muddle as the present is for us now. And so historical novels, I think, can better give some sort of sense of, I mean, one of the topics last night was luck. Historical novels can ask the what-if question. If this hadn't happened, what would have been the result?
That's wonderful. And one of the things that I find really fascinating too about the way that you're working through the trilogy of the historical novel is that we often think of history as a diachronic process of something that there's origins, causes, as you were describing, in development. But you really sit almost synchronically. You almost take a capture of the 1870s and really tarry with the details of the 1870s in Canadian history. And at this particular point, you describe Canadian history as having a radical transformation. And I don't know if many Canadians would know all of the details. Of course, we know of Confederation, we know of the common details of Canadian history, but you pull out things that people wouldn't know about, like the Massacre of Cypress Hill and the events that you were just describing to lead up to the novel. I was wondering, why the 1870s? What really drew you to the 1870s?
I think one of the reasons why I was so intensely interested in the 1870s was, first of all, what you've just mentioned. It was, basically the first decade of Canada at least being a quasi-nation. It was not a country that was fully independent in any way from the British Empire, but it could exercise policy to a greater or lesser degree. And so coming from the West, I wanted to possibly, I mean, I don't mean to sound too grandiose, but I wanted to bring to the attention of people who didn't live in the West how very small events in the West had a big impact on the country at large. So the Cypress Hills massacre led to the formation of the Northwest Mounted Police, who then secured Western Canada for European settlement, or for people who were immigrating from Ontario to the West. They made the history of the Canadian West somewhat different than the American West. But it also, the 1870s, actually meant the destruction of other nations' way of life, including, the Métis, all the different Indian nations in the West. And it seemed to me that this was kind of a breaking point in the West, in which one way of life died, I would say, a very quick death, and another claimed a toehold.
And that's another thing that I really find fascinating, the way that you have articulated the historical novel in Canada, that you take pains in your lecture to mention that you're not trying to write history as a novel, as you were discussing right now, but there is this opportunity to go to luck, to pull out repressed histories, or histories that we've lost, histories of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and to represent them in a way that we haven't seen before. So if you're not going all the way to rewrite Canadian history, I wonder if in some way when you're thinking about writing the historical novel, that you're re-articulating what Charles Taylor, one of our prominent Canadian philosophers, has called our social imaginary, or those deeply embedded ideas that become the foundational points of our culture. Is that something that novel writing can impact? If it's not to rewrite history, does it change our social imaginary?
I think by definition, any writer, perhaps particularly novelists, are outsiders. And so I think that in my case, I've also said that the historical novel is not history, but it's about history. And by that I mean that the historical novel can question and sometimes contradict our deeply held notions about the past. It should make us, I think, uncomfortable rather than comfortable. One of the problems with the historical novel is traditionally, particularly in the 19th century, it tended to be a vehicle for what I would call middle-class nationalism. It was a way for people to create myths, often racial myths, about their past. I guess that in my novels, one of the things I've tried to do is to say there were other people out there. And in my imagining, I often wonder what would have happened to, the Métis experiment in Winnipeg with, Louis Riel's attempt to create a republic there, because that was an extraordinary mingling of European and native cultures. And if those cultures had another 100 years or 50 years to develop, perhaps the Canadian West and Canada itself would be, a very different place.
And that process of reading, or reading through the historical novel for Canadians, brings me to something that Joan Barfoot said at her recent convocation address to Western graduates in 2012. I believe I had that year right, 2012.
I think so.
Yes, indeed.
Time flies when you're old.
And I'm going to read a passage from what Joan said, because I think it's incredibly important to and opposite to what we're talking about. She says, "Reading well will remind you that you and yours are not the only people on earth, and that your circumstances are extraordinary, that each of us, just being in this room today in the Convocation Hall, is an astonishing luxury, because none of us, nor you nor I, is the center of any known universe. By and large, your troubles and mine are not only not catastrophic, they're barely interesting. In fact, one of my novels is called Luck, and this is why I thought it'd be such an important point here to begin. And it came about to explore the notion that in this time, in this particular part of the world, that's what we are by and large, lucky. Those of us in this room right now, and I suppose that would apply to this room as well, may have worked hard and overcome serious troubles and made the most of small and large opportunities. But just being here means we've won a long odds cosmic crapshoot. Your advice to graduates here goes against the grain, or a prevailing idea, perhaps a myth, that hard work will lead to the reward with the right amount of determination. What this misses is the interconnected web of opportunities that many of us have, where success is in some ways based on a notion of luck, the circumstances in which we're born. How did this idea of luck become such an important thing for you?
Oh, poor Guy. Let's trail this sucker over. All sorts of ways, I suppose. Just small things that I had a mother who read to me and a sister who read to me. And I remember the magic day when I was about 4 and I looked at a book and I could read it all by myself. And I just fell in love with words and wasn't that lucky that we actually had a book that I think was a child's version of Shakespeare or something really pretentious for a 4-year-old. So there was that kind of nurturing that you really can't take for granted if you look around a bit. Then I went into journalism when I basically got the boot from Western. I mean, you may say I have a degree, and I do, but it was a paltry little thing by the time I got it. But I went into journalism, and in those years as a reporter, you meet, people would always say you must meet the most interesting people. Well, yeah, you do, but what is more to the point is that you tend to meet people, at least in the kind of reporting that I was doing, at real extremes. So, I had a summer job at the Free Press here, and I think I was the only woman in the newsroom, naturally, in those days. And I was working a Saturday morning. Some guy wiped out his whole family. He killed his whole family down around Chatham. We found the dead wife's sister lived in Lucan. They popped me in a cab, sent me up to Lucan to get the pictures.
Wow.
And because even as an adolescent, sort of old adolescent, I was fairly ruthless. I took their whole photo album, but I sat with that sister for an hour and a half. I didn't actually care about deadlines at that point because she was wrecked, because everybody had been wiped out. But I took her photo album, and I didn't use hardly anything of what she'd said because that wasn't why it was there. But things like that, or getting over Edgar, I used a scene from an early Fatal that I covered when I worked in Windsor, and again was still very young. And a guy was hit by a train and decapitated. And so when we got to the scene, there are the little lumps of body up and down. So, that's not useful in day-to-day life, but it came into really excellent use. In any case, all I mean is that I have been always attracted to extremes, not necessarily those physical extremes, but emotional extremes as well. I've killed people in several of my novels just out of basic pique. It's not like it's war or there's no, ideology behind it. It's just a really bad day. Sort of the culmination of a relatively unhappy life. So I've stopped killing people, I think, but there's a litter of dead people for no cosmic reason. Then in my late 20s, I went across the Sahara Desert. I went to Morocco and Algeria. This is something I would not, of course, do now because there I'd be, and no one would pay the ransom. And into Mali and Niger. And that kind of reinforces that whatever else, there were little villages of starving people because the Sahara was moving south, creeping into people's lives further and further. There would be nothing in these places except Singer sewing machines, oddly enough. Those Singer salesmen were really something. But I remember driving out of a village with a little girl running behind our truck, carrying a baby, saying, please take my sister, with a little baby. And whatever else is going on here, nothing like that happens here. And you think, but for a crapshoot of it really is a crapshoot to whom you're born, where you're born, what century you're born in, and specifically female as a woman. I think, man, I hit it lucky to be, sort of the 60s onward, to be a repellent boomer, but just totally lucked out. So, particularly as a woman, but also all the guys too. We're just lucky, and we should probably try to know that every day. So, shit's happening in our lives, but basically, we can flush.
Yes. Well, on that idea too, there's another point that you make in the same address about, you spoke about your grandmother as a feminist, and I thought that was really fascinating to hear not just your mother, but your grandmother. And I read somewhere that she was not only a politician, but a suffrage activist, which I thought was a fascinating detail and such an important influence, and how many of the gains from her generation were lost. And it speaks specifically to what you were mentioning. You encouraged young women and men to, this is another quote from that address which I really struck me, don't give a millimeter, don't give up any ground that could diminish the rights of women ever again. Which is, such an important topic right now. In light of your remarks, I wanted to ask whether you have seen significant losses lately in terms of the question of feminism with your own experience. I'm thinking of many young women today who don't identify with the word feminist. This is particularly interesting in light of the fact that you were the first Canadian representative to the international, and another detail that was fascinating with the first literary festival here, but the first international feminist book fair and festival. What has happened to this term feminism in your perspective?
Well, feminism got bad media. I blame journalism. But aside from that, I think we've now been saved by Beyonce, because I believe she's now publicly acknowledged herself as a feminist. So I think we're back in the golden age of feminism. And Lady Gaga is probably fair help as well. So I feel able to relax now, pretty much. My grandmother, whom I never knew because she was dead before I was born, she hung out with Agnes MacPhail and Nellie McClung, and so that was very impressive to me. It was less impressive to my mother, who had apparently stayed home and looked after the household while her mother swanned around to feminist conferences. I think we've seen some of this happen in current generations too. But it's more a historical dynamic that the first wave incentives kind of lapsed after the Second World War, when everybody had to go home. Everybody got jobs, but then the men came back and the women, oh, wait a minute. And then there were the magazines like the ones my mother subscribed to, like Red Book, and they were all about how to make your man happy. Not in the current sense of 10 groovy things to do in bed, but in the 10 really terrific desserts that'll bring them home on time. So those were I would steal a glance at my mom's magazines, a poor woman. And one reason I wrote Dancing in the Dark, which is in fact one of those, oops, the guy's dead books, is that the protagonist of Dancing in the Dark, which Martha Henry played brilliantly in the movie, followed the rules. And she followed them to the letter, partly because it was her own nature, but also because those were the rules. And it seemed reasonable to me. She just snapped, grabbed a tomato knife, and that was it. But that way lies a lot of unhappy women, which is why Betty Friedan tapped in and so on. But I have to say, despite the occasional journalist I know who's here, that when I worked in newsrooms, often as one of very few women, the men were often quite frightened of women and of having power, having to share power. I mean, that's a natural human thing. People don't like to share power. Give it up, possibly at the end of a tomato knife or whatever, but nobody gives up power willingly. So there was a lot of negotiating and a lot of ways in the media to use nouns and verbs to really harmful effect. And so, the sort of no shaving, bra burning things. I mean, maybe somebody burned a bra at some point, but, most of us really cherished our bras. So that was just an image issue. But, image is very important. But now, as I say, with Beyonce on our side, we're golden.
It's interesting, too, in Canadian history with major arts and literature movements, thinking even the Confederation poets, there was Pauline Johnson, and the group of 7 on the periphery was Emily Carr. So we have some major heavy hitter female figures in Canadian history. And actually, when I was looking through both of your backgrounds, I found a nice thread. I'm sure this is a thread for many Canadian authors, but the figure of Margaret Laurence for both of you is such an important figure. In your recent Margaret Laurence lecture, Guy, you wrote, Margaret Laurence was an essential literary guide, a woman whose writing helped to open my eyes to what might be done with material that lay right under my nose. And Joan, similarly, I read somewhere that Margaret Laurence was the first person you read that convinced you that one could write about what you called the ordinary lives of women specifically, and be a great writer. I was wondering, for Guy and then to Joan, but Guy, you have a great story about when you'd won a prize and there was a letter that you had received from Margaret Laurence. Could you tell us that story?
I actually referenced that in my Margaret Laurence lecture, much to my embarrassment when and I should preface this by saying that Alice Munro was also another figure who taught me that so-called ordinary lives, in quotation marks, or lives in small towns or rural areas could also be the stuff of great literature. Anyway, the year that I won my first Governor General's Award for a collection of short stories called Man Descending, and I still blush and cringe to think of this, Alice Munro, who had blurbed my book, was also on the short list. And I won the Governor General's Award, which caused perfectly understandable consternation in all literary circles. And there was actually quite a bit of discussion in the press about the travesty of this, which made me very uncomfortable, mostly because I agreed with it, but secondly, kind of being held up as an object of ridicule, people saying, they should break his pencils and never let him write anything again. I went into a funk. And I thought, okay, it was hard enough to write one book. Now, how am I ever going to write another book with this kind of sitting on my shoulder? And out of the blue, I received a letter from Margaret Laurence, and she didn't reference any of this that was going on, but the letter was incredibly kind, and she said some very nice things to me and about my work. I had never met her and never did meet her face to face. And one of the things that she said, I remember one of the lines was, now that you have won this award, there are a lot of people who are going to feed you a lot of bullshit about being great. And that there are going to be a lot of people that want something from you, which was only partially true. But she said, okay, the business of being a writer is writing. And so I said, okay, if that's what I have to do, then I'm going to do it. And so I kind of shortly after that, I went back to writing. So she gave me it was kind of like a voice from a great distance. The letter arrived, I kept it, and it's now in the archives at the University of Calgary. But it was very important to me, as was her work very important to me before I ever received a letter from her.
Mm. I didn't ever meet her either, but I read her when I was in late high school, I guess, and I was growing up in Owen Sound. I had spent like 17, 18 years planning to get out of Owen Sound, so I was near to achieving my goal. But I hung out at the library a great deal, and I had worked my way really pompously, I'm sure, through all the Russians, those great men in the tundra and the blah, blah, blood on the snow, as I used to call it. And it seemed to me at that time, in that place, that writers were, well, for one thing, they were male. for another thing, they were dead, and they were far away. So Margaret Laurence was a discovery in the reading just because she wasn't dead, and that was, I had no idea then of becoming a writer because I just had it in my head that they were dead. And they certainly weren't Canadian, and almost certainly they weren't women, because I hadn't read women until I read Margaret. And then I thought, blood can be elsewhere, it can be in the kitchen. Sorry to keep sounding so very violent and morbid, but she made it possible to think of books that way, and as Guy says, there have been so many others since. And in fact, there were some before who got lost in the critical shuffle, I guess, much like many women artists did. But Sarah Jeanette Duncan and Nellie, for that matter, Nellie McClung, lovely writers. Ethel Wilson, brilliant, but sort of ignored in the cosmic scheme of things in our society. And then along came Margaret Laurence, and boom, and then Alice and Carol Shields, of course. There's a whole new tradition, or not a new tradition, but a good, solid tradition now of real life in there.
I'm just going to quickly insert something here because you mentioned Ethel Wilson. Margaret Laurence said to me in her letter, "I'm only doing this because Ethel Wilson did the same thing for me."
And of course, we could add Joan Barfoot to that list that she was mentioning of Canadian female novelists that have blazed a trail for other writers to come. I don't want to hog the mic the entire time for myself because I could continue to talk to these two forever. I want to have the opportunity for you guys to have some questions as well. Is there any questions for Guy or for Joan that you'd like to ask? Yes, sure. And say your question quite loud so that we can get it.
It's a question for both writers. Why do you like the city you live in, if you do like it, and how does living there affect your writing?
One of the reasons that I live in Saskatoon and have spent virtually all of my life there. If I'm going to descend into the abyss of autobiography, I mean, arriving in Saskatoon because I came from a very small town and going to university was a very liberating experience for me. My first encounter with a very large library, my first encounter with people who took ideas seriously, and I think I was a bit like those goslings that get imprinted very early on. They usually follow a man with a pail, but when I arrived in Saskatoon, it just sort of stuck with me. And I've returned there many times. How has it influenced my writing? I've only written one novel and a few short stories in which Saskatoon as a place played a role. But it's a Western city, and almost all of my work has been about the Canadian West. I used research resources that are in Saskatoon, like the short archives, the archives in the local public library, etc. So that's probably the best that I can do to say how where I live influenced me and why I like it.
Oh dear, this is a bit embarrassing because I live in London. And when I went to university here and then I left and went and worked in newspapers, other places. When I decided that I needed to buckle down and write fiction as well as earn a living, I thought back to the jobs I'd had to that point and thought, oh, the London Free Press didn't give me stomach acid, whereas the Toronto Sun was giving me stomach acid. That's when I was working there for a while, and it was making me very tense and anxious, so I just downed tools. So I decided to try for a job here, which I got, and so I could do both things, that I could write during the day and go earn a living by being sleepy at night. But until then, I'd never lived anywhere longer than a couple of years, so I thought, I could spend a couple of years in London, write off, draft a novel and move on to whatever the next thing is. But you know, this city is like quicksand. And I just sunk in deeper and deeper. And, you know, I'm way over my hips at this point. So, I mean, I'm content here. I don't know that it affects my writing at all, except that it's an easy enough place to live that the mind can go anywhere. You know, I can do my extremes because I'm really awfully, disgustingly comfortable here. So, nervous about the election, but nevertheless comfortable.
Other questions?
What inspires you on a daily basis?
Somebody said, you know, last night, which I think is true, is inspiration is for amateurs. Saul Bellow said that the difference between what he called a professional writer and an amateur writer is that a professional could work on a bad day. Now, I'm not dismissing the question when I say that. I would say, particularly as I get older, I have fewer moments of inspiration. I mean, in the sense that writing for me now has become more of a craft because I think, or I hope that I've learned to do it better than when I was young. When I was young, my first book was basically like 14 years of built up steam. And, you know, I blasted it off in a book. And then I suddenly realized, well, okay, I got that off my chest. Now I'm going to have to learn how to write. And it's something that I'm still trying to learn how to do. So my inspiration, I would say, is to be a better work person or a better crafts person, to pay more attention to how I make stories, how I make novels.
Yeah, I agree. And age isn't helping, is it? I think, I guess the way I would assess myself is that I have an idea, like I'm a very slow thinker, so if I have an idea every 3 or 4 years, that's my inspiration. So I would never count on daily inspiration, which boils down to coffee for me. That's all I got. So yeah, I get up in the morning, bang the coffee on, and then we see where the day goes. But I can't say I've been able to work through my worst times, but you do have to be able to work through the bad times. And sometimes, as is the case with any kind of work, I think it helps to go to work, you know, if you're having a bad time. I find I have fewer ideas that I care passionately about now, so I might be lengthening my time. But really, an inspiration is like a moment in some portion of some day, and from then on it's 3 or 4 years of working with the idea and the characters and learning to have them in your life and trying to find the right words, finding the, you know, going through a page and saying 3 syllables is the wrong rhythm, I need to find a 2-syllable word that means the same thing but has a better rhythm, that kind of thing. That kind of, I want beauty, I want music in the words, so that takes a while, but it's not, doesn't come with inspiration really, although sometimes you can sit there and be blipping away at the keyboard and just the most wonderful, wise thought comes to mind and say, holy shit, I didn't know I knew that. I am so clever, and then you can go have another coffee.
There's a question. Yeah, or
On a different day, you would probably get a different answer. Because I'm intensely interested in the historical novel for a long time, I would say probably the two historical novelists that I found the most compelling, the most interesting, and the most accomplished were the two British writers, Pat Barker and Hilary Mantel. But I also find that as I get older, I return to books that I read in my 20s and that I really liked, and I reread them. So right now, I'm reading a lot of Christopher Isherwood, and I'd forgotten, or maybe I hadn't forgotten how good a novelist and a prose writer he was, but reading him again is sort of confirming that for me all over again.
Yeah, well, you stole my Hilary Mantel. Because I am not generally a reader of historical fiction, particularly, although I've read Guy's, of course, and that's, but you've already talked about the novel part of the history, and that's what's important. But I really thought I knew everything I needed to know about the Henry saga and the wives, and then I started reading her, and it's not in the history, which I know the basics of, but it's in the words and the dazzle of her talent for telling those characters in that setting, and so that, and Pat Barker too, the First World War material is brilliant. But I will follow, even sometimes being disappointed, I will follow Ian McEwan practically anywhere. So I'm kind of, I have a big weakness for some Brits. I loved Chris Hitchens, and I was incredibly sad when he died because I needed more bitterness in my life. So yeah, I mean, we keep talking about age here, so we're like, this is a retirement home couch.
Exactly. Will we be able to get off the couch? That's the big
I think I might
question.
be stuck for the day here, kind of on a tilt. But the older I get, because I've read so much for so many years, I want my socks knocked off, and it gets harder and harder to find something that knocks my socks off. So I want not only to be writing extremes, but now I'm really keen to read something extreme that really makes something happen to both my heart and my head, and that's hard to find. Oops.
So a question here, yes.
My question is, you spend your days looking at a blank page or a blank screen. When you're looking at an audience, are you performing, teaching, or sharing?
Woo.
Whoa, we both went.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if this is a moment for frankness or not. So I guess in part I'm performing. I think anybody who appears in public, even if it's a bride at her wedding or a groom, is performing. They're aware that there are people who are either looking at them or listening to them or whatever. So, part of it is performance. Part of it is teaching, because I want, and part of it is sharing also, is that I want people to feel as passionately about words as Joan and I do. There's a question about writing a novel, and John McGahern said, how do you write a good novel? You write one good sentence, and then you write another good sentence. And novels are illusions, right? I mean, they may seem more real than reality itself, but they're simply words on a page. And if you can't manage words on a page, you can't create that illusion. Part of, like, when I speak to students, what I try to do is get them to believe that writing matters, and that they have to think clearly, and they have to think deeply to write well. Sometimes that's difficult to convince them to do, but I think it's important.
It's It's a tough one. I actually don't ever feel that I'm teaching anything because I'm not sure about the concept. I've not ever been a real teacher. And I would say that because each of us has different parts of our personality that come out in different circumstances, I'm guessing that there's a performance aspect to this, clearly, because you could, if you got cranky, just snap right out of here. So there's a certain incentive to keep everybody sitting. But that's just part of, that's a very small part of any aspect of my life, and I kind of enjoy it. I enjoy meeting everybody and chattering, and honestly, I don't know about Guy, but my experience is people hardly ever ask writers anything, so we're just thrilled to be asked. But in my own home, I don't perform. I drink coffee.
A question here.
You've talked about inspiration being for amateurs and not needing inspiration to do your work. And this question, either of you can answer this, but do you feel there's a difference in quality when you write from inspiration and you write because it's your work?
Okay, I mean, I know that I sounded dismissive when I talked about inspiration. Perhaps I sounded dismissive because a lot of people who claim to want to write feel that they can only write in a burst of inspiration. Yeah, of course, the definition of inspiration would be the idea, the image, the event, the character that makes you want to sit down and write about him or her. That's kind of like the given. I can tell in my own writing. I'm not sure whether a reader can. I know in my own writing when I'm carried away, and that doesn't very often happen. But sometimes I'll write 3 or 4 pages in a burst. And unlike me, who I write and I rewrite and I rewrite and I rewrite, I may get 3 or 4 pages that I can say, okay, this might need a little bit of fiddling, but not as much as the 40 pages that preceded it. So in that moment I could say, yes, I was inspired. Maybe I was feeling more and thinking less when I wrote that. But yeah, inspiration is important, but it's something that you can't rely on. It's not a crutch, nor is it an excuse for not writing. I mean, a lot of people say, I wasn't inspired, so I didn't write. And then after 8 months, they've discovered that they weren't inspired, so they haven't done anything for 8 months.
Yeah, once past that initial, whatever we might call it, inspiration, the idea and the excitement of starting something new and thrilling, there is still, while you're working every day, and it is work, but there's still what started you off in the first place, which is what's going to happen next, and why are these people doing this? And so it's almost always interesting. It might not be blindingly inspiring, and it is work, but it's also always interesting. I have wakened up in the morning sometimes wondering not what's going to happen to me, because I pretty much know what's going to happen to me. I'm going to have coffee and go to the keyboard, and it's really not interesting. But what's going to happen to whoever it is I'm writing about? Because I don't always know. I know where I'm going to end up maybe, but not how we're going to get there. So it's always, it doesn't become drudgery, I guess is what I mean, for the most part. Sometimes it's drudgery, but even drudgery is useful. But there's always the incentive, I think, to keep going and say, what happens next? Because that's the whole point, really, is why? Why is the essential question, probably. Why is this happening? Why is she doing this? Why is he doing that? Who is this person? And what will happen to them today? I don't know if no, of course you're not old enough because I'm going to do an old thing again. But when I was a kid on radio, there was something called Maggie Muggins. And the little Maggie Muggins, oh, somebody remembers, oh my God. But the Maggie Muggins radio program, which was her going next door to torment her neighbor, Mr. McGarity, the tagline was always, I wonder what'll happen tomorrow, Mr. McGarity. And there Maggie Muggins would go. And that's pretty much how my days as a writer go. I wonder what'll happen tomorrow, Mr. McGarity.
For two authors who haven't sat in conversation for a while, it's like getting the old band back together. You were absolutely wonderful this afternoon. Thank you for asking such great questions, and please join me in thanking Guy.